All right, good morning. It's March 12th, 2013. You are here for Disproportionality Data, Unpacking the Mystery. I am George Trieste, the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project Director. This webinar is provided by the Napa County Office of Education through funding from the California Department of Education Special Education Division. On the line today, we have with us our districts representing significantly disproportionality districts, districts who are disproportionate representation, and a few others. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a brief overview of our project. The Napa County Office of Education has a grant through the California Department of Education to assist districts in the area of disproportionality. We do this by working directly with 28 disproportionate districts and their technical assistance facilitators to plan and implement their plans to reduce disproportionality in special education. Our team also works with districts who are significantly disproportionate by providing individual assistance, referring to technical assistance facilitators, and engaging districts in community of practice meetings. Lastly, we have a great website, SPPTAP.org, and we are doing quarterly webinars, which this is one of. I'm here at the Napa County Office of Education with our wonderful team, Napa, Connie Silva-Prasad, Rebecca Anderson, Susan Stewart, Linda Blong, and Jen DeShazer, who are behind the scenes providing wonderful technical support for this webinar. And now, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Eyler. John currently operates an educational services and consulting firm in Southern California. His work is focused on assisting districts to develop school-wide systems of preventing behavior incidents and mitigating disproportionate representation. Hi, John. His work also includes the development of intensive intervention programs for students with a history of significant behavior challenges. He has trained thousands of administrators, support providers, teachers, and parents on the topics of discipline, positive behavior interventions, motivation, disproportionality, and equity in education. Additionally, Dr. Eyler is a part-time faculty member at the University of Southern California, USC, where he teaches courses in educational psychology. John, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for doing this. Take it away. Press *6.
There we go. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you great. Thank you.
Great. I want to start by saying thank you, George and Connie, Linda, and the rest of the technical assistance groups for giving me an opportunity to be part of this. This is a topic that I'm excited about and passionate about, but I also realize it's a topic that's not all that exciting, generally speaking, or not all that glamorous. But I do understand, though, that this is important work in terms of being intentional and targeted in the work we do with disproportionality. So what we put together for you this morning is really some objectives that would, the goal is to really prepare you as a district to build capacity locally to use data you already have in your district to address this issue of disproportionality, or the challenge, rather. So what we'll do is the next hour and a half or so, we're going to talk about 3 data sources and strategies that are used to determine disproportionate representation. I would like to give you an understanding of how those are used to examine root causes. There's a bit of a disclaimer on that, is that when we go through this process, it's not that you arrive at a single root cause. Rather, the process that I would share with you, are the data sources and the strategies, really lead a team to understanding root cause or root causes better. Review some sample data. I'll show you some work that I've done with multiple districts, and at the very end, I'll leave you with a template that I use with districts in requesting data out of their system. to be able to run these reports. In terms of an agenda, we'll look at 3 data sources, 3 different types of reports. There's a brainstorming question where sometimes we have whether it's the 3 self-assessment tools that are outlined in the Technical Assistance Guide for Disproportionality in California, or whether it's these 3 reports. Sometimes we just don't simply have the data we need to address specific questions. So this section of the agenda addresses that. What do we do when we don't have the data or the sources to answer the questions we have specific to our district? We'll take a look at 2 district reports. I've pulled some sample data from 2 districts I've worked with to share with you, and then I'll leave you with the template at the very end. You should have, before we get into the chat, you should have, in terms of documents, a copy of the PowerPoint. There should be a document that has various tables, or actually there are multiple documents, case miss, ODRs, another one, and then there should be an Excel spreadsheet. If you have those, if you can just open them up on your computer as you're watching, we're going to reference those in a little bit, but it would be helpful to have those handy. Also, on the left-hand side, down towards the bottom is the chat pod. Please feel free to post comments or questions in there. I've asked George to help me monitor that chat box, and so I expect him to interrupt me every now and then and let me know when there's a question or maybe there's a pattern of questions. And so I'm going to ask him to stop me at certain points and throw some of those questions out. So please feel free to use those as we go along, put your comments and your questions in there. At the very end, I'm also going to open up the line to give an opportunity for people to chime in on the audio and ask questions and dialogue a little bit more. Let's take a look at 3 data sources. These are 3 existing sources that are typically within your district. They're not new data sources. Rather, what I'd like to do is kind of put a lens of disproportionality on these data sources and explain how they are used in terms of this disproportionality work. So the case miss is the California Special Education Management Information System. That's the acronym. You see the link on there to the CDE website for the Technical Assistance Guide on case miss. Case miss has 5 tables, and case miss data are reported in December 1st, and in June 30th. So with regard to the data I use for districts, I use Table A, and that's from the December file. It's an unduplicated pupil count. So it's basically your official special education count, if you will, in terms of the number of students you have in your district. That's also the table that CDE uses to calculate disproportionality. The second table I use is Table C, and that's the discipline table. That's reported in June, and that's what CDE uses to make determinations of disproportionality in indicators 4A and 4B. The second set of data comes from the Student Information System. When CDE calculates disproportionality, they use the Table A in December, and they also use the enrollment data from your SPEDs. So it's reported through CalPads, and they compare those two to do the calculations. So when I request data from a district, I ask them to pull demographic data out of their Student Information System, so we can use that as their total enrollment or general ed enrollment figures. The last set on here is the office discipline referral data. So I realize that and this is students who are currently in special education, suspended or removed more than 10 days in a school year. That's one set of data that we could look at. Office discipline referral data for me is more impactful because I think it gives a bigger picture of what's truly going on with regard to trends and disproportionality. You know, for
Hello, and welcome to Global Meet, formerly Ready Conference. Please enter your passcode. Hello, and welcome to Global Meet, formerly Ready Conference. Please enter your passcode. Please hold while I confirm your passcode. Thank you. Your passcode is confirmed. All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6. When you hear the tone, you will be the 30th person to join the meeting. This meeting is now being recorded.
Attachment in the documents that's titled Case List Table A. I'm just going to highlight some fields in here. The Case List Table A has multiple data points, and I don't use the entire Table A file, so I want to highlight some of the data points that have been most useful in this work of disproportionality. So the first one I'd have you highlight is A11, which is the SSID. This is the state identifier. This is important because this is the only unique identifier that is consistent across data sources. So whether we're looking at behavior data, whether we're looking at special ed data, or data from the student information system, the SSID is the only unique identifier we can use to compare other data points. So, and I'll just, a brief example, one of the things I do with districts is I compare the data they're reporting to make sure that this disproportionality concern is not a data issue. So I'll show you some examples later on, but there are sometimes districts who report, you know, for the same 100 kids, they report different race and ethnicity codes in 2 different databases. Well, that's a problem with regard to disproportionality. So the only way to analyze that is by using this SSID across databases. The other one I'd like to point out is A13, which is birth date, and that corresponds with A35, entry date. And I use both of those dates to calculate an age of entry into special education. So if you take entry date and you subtract birth date, you'll get an age at which kids enter the system. And this is helpful in terms of targeting age ranges or even grade ranges for intervention. If we find that the majority of our kids are entering at, say, elementary school or maybe at middle school for ED, maybe we want to target our intervention at the middle school first and then roll it out to elementary, high school later on. So those have been very helpful. A45 is another field I would highlight on there, and that's in regular class. It's used as a least LRE indicator. And then I skipped one, so I'm going to go back to A27, that's referred by. So we look at patterns, trends in terms of who are these people who are referring kids. Are we finding more parent referrals, or are more referrals coming from within the system? The next table to look at is Table C. Table C. You have to, excuse me, I got slammed with a cold last night, so I'm fighting through, and I apologize in advance for issues or sniffles or what have you. The one cell in here that I want to highlight is C8, discipline days. This is the table that's used to calculate indicator 4A and 4B. And what I found in this is that oftentimes your Table C on case lists is not necessarily the most accurate in most cases. Your student information system is the database of record primarily for most districts for their discipline data. And oftentimes it doesn't translate over correctly into Table C. So Table C is where CDE uses the data in terms of this calculation. What you can do now for districts who are out over-identified and indicators 4A and 4B, you could use this now to kind of project. These data are reported in June, so we have between now and June to monitor this a little bit for the following year. The state has set a cap at 2.6%. And so what you can do right now is take a look at the number of students in each race and ethnicity category within special education. So let's just say in this district I have 100 students who are Latino in special education. What I would do is instead of use the target of 2.6, I would just use 2.5 to be safe. I would multiply that by 2.5, and it will give you a cap or a number of students that you cannot go over in terms of being disproportionate. So I have one example I wrote down here. If I have 485 Latino students with disabilities, and I multiply that times 2.5%, I'm going to have a cap of 12. I need to make sure that there are no more than 12 students in that category to stay out of disproportionality in that particular cell. So I want to say this with caution because it's not necessarily just a numbers game. And, I've had some districts who, by the time it hits the field or gets down to sites, they say, oh, we can't identify kids with UD anymore, or we can't suspend kids anymore, remove kids because we're disproportionate. That's not the idea. The idea is to use this as a tool for monitoring. So for districts I'm working with now who are out before A and B, I've recommended that they right now pull data on kids who are suspended or removed 8 days or more for this school year. And then let's run the calculations in terms of percentages to see where we're at. It gives us a little bit of time to work with those kids who are right on the cusp, but it also gives us an idea of whether or not we might be over that target of 2.6%. The next table you can pull up is Student Information System, or SIS data. The fields that I would ask you to highlight in here, school code up at the top. Race and ethnicity are key. This is total enrollment now, disability 1. Oops, I'm sorry. Looking at the wrong one there. And then down towards the bottom, we've got English language, CELT, and free and reduced lunch. So those bottom three are a little bit unique. I've had some districts who, I'm thinking one in particular who has a high Latino population. They were particularly interested in looking at English learners, English work, and also CELT scores. So what they found is that they have a high at-risk population of Latino students being identified as specific learning disability, as having a specific learning disability. And so what they're doing is taking a look at just that small subgroup, which of those kids are actually not which, but of those students, what are their CELT scores and what do those look like? And what they're trying to do is kind of distinguish or parse out whether or not this is a linguistic difference issue or if it's a true disability, because they're seeing an elevation in their Latino SOD. Free and reduced lunch, FRL, is simply an indicator that's used to take a look at the impact of free and reduced lunch in this work. The last table to take a look at, ODR, Office Discipline Referral Data. Up at the top, I'd point out school code. This is helpful in terms of disaggregating data by school code. School type, I've had some districts use that to take a look at charter schools, the impact that charters have on their disproportionate representation. And then I'll just point out from date down, these are fields that are used in terms of PBIS implementation. So these are the fields that should be built into a system for an ongoing analysis at school sites. We want to be able to take a look at incidents at each school site by location, who's reporting these incidents, how are we responding to kids once they show up in the office. The other thing I want to point out with regard to office discipline referral data is when we pull data, you're going to get event data. What that means is, I'll give you an example of a district I was just working with. So far to date, or through February, this district has 11,755 discipline events. That doesn't mean they have 11,755 students who have contributed to those events. They actually have only 4,904 students who contributed to those 11,000 plus events. And what we do is, I would caution you on separating those two when you do an analysis. Composition is different than a percentage of events. And let me just give you an example. I might find that the composition of those students, I might find 18% of those students, those 4,904 students, are African American. And if I put that up against the total composition for the district at 9%, I can see that there's a disproportionate representation in our discipline in composition. The other thing, and I'll give another example of this in a little bit, but those 18% of African American students in the discipline file may actually be accounting for a larger percentage of discipline events when compared to other race and ethnic categories. So, for example, that 18% of kids may be accounting for 50% of those events, 11,755 events. And that really just compounds the concern. So we have a fewer amount of kids, fewer number of kids making up a larger number of events if we disaggregate or separate the composition and events. And I'll show you what it looks like in just a little bit. But I just want to put a caution out there. What I'd like to do now is just, we can use the chat, whether there are questions on data sources or comments that you have, and I'm going to give it just a second to check in, see if there are questions with regard to those 3 data sources: case list, student information system, and office discipline referral data. All right, let's move on to reports.
John, hold on for a moment because, give a few more moments for people to write into chat. So hold on for just a moment.
Okay.
Okay, John, go ahead.
All right, we're going to move into 3 different types of reports. And the first is, I want to place an emphasis on the data workbook, the data analysis workbook. In the Technical Assistance Guide and the guidance from the CDE and from the Technical Assistance Project, there are 3 self-assessment tools that districts utilize in this process of analyzing root causes for disproportionality. So one is Wisconsin checklist. Second one is, which is primarily qualitative. The other one is an NCREST tool, which uses a 5-point Likert scale, and it was originally designed to be used with elementary schools. And then the third is the data analysis workbook. And the data analysis workbook uses 3 calculation methodologies. It's the tool, or the self-assessment tool, that I place more of an emphasis on because, number one, it's quantitative, and number 2, I think it gives us a very kind of narrowed and precise picture of what's going on in terms of overall trends of disproportionality within the district. This is also the work of Eddie Fergus out of the Technical Assistance Center at NYU. And he has been a consultant to the Technical Assistance Project and CDE in terms of its work of disproportionality. So what you'll see on the following slides are the data analysis workbook calculations. Classification index, composition index, and risk ratio are the 3 that are used. What I've done is I've taken those and I use a different format for districts I contract with. So what you're going to see are samples of that format that I use. However, using the data workbook will give you the same exact information. What I'd like you to see in this process is the usefulness of being able to use the data workbook in kind of pinpointing some possible root causes, or maybe pushing teams in a direction of identifying the root causes. The link down at the bottom to NYU, the Metro Center, is down there for you if you'd like to access that. I believe it's also on the SPP-TAP website. Before we get into this, I also want to make a comment that in terms of identifying root causes, it's a complex, multifaceted process. And I would say that of the districts I'm working with, there isn't a situation where I've had one district land on the exact same root cause as another district. It's usually multiple root causes, or it's a little bit different, but the root cause process isn't as easy as one might think in terms of, oh, this is where our issue is. I've had 2 districts to date where it's definitely there's a data issue, but I would say that doesn't necessarily explain the complete disproportionality concern for those 2 LEAs. So what we're looking at here, this is a classification index. This is overall classification. What this is saying, that of all of our students in this particular district, this is a K-12 district, of all of the students in the district, we have 10.7% who are classified as a student with disability. They qualify for special ed. If we move across that blue row down the bottom, you'll find overall African American classification is 20.5%. And we'll move to the far left, Hispanic Latino classification is 14.5%. So if I compare those 2, the Latino and the African American, to the overall classification, I can see that there's an elevation. There's an extreme elevation in the African American population and an elevation in the Latino population. So initially, off the bat, we can see that there's an emerging trend in terms of what may be part of the issue in this particular district. It may not necessarily just be the African American population, may also be Latino. I also want to point out that what you'll see up here is total GE enrollment. GE stands for General Ed, and I've since changed the wording on this. General Ed is actually total enrollment. So when you look at 4,055 as the total enrollment for Latino students in the district, that's all students, General Ed and Special Ed. And then above that, you have Special Ed enrollment. That's obviously Special Ed only. The next calculation is a composition index. And this really takes a look at within the total enrollment for this district. Of the 16,393 students, 4,055 are identified as Latino. What is the composition? What's the makeup? What percentage does that account for in terms of total enrollment? And we see in this district it's 24.74, almost 25% of total enrollment. When we look at the special ed file, they have 1,757 students. The Latino population accounts for 30, 33, 35. It's a little bit small on my screen, you can see. But it's elevated, right? It's over 30% students classified as Latino in their special ed file. To the right, you'll see this GE proportion. This is these parameters. I think the question that seems is, well, if it's elevated just a little bit, are we disproportionate? I mean, at what point do we say, wow, this is something that's concerning and we start to pay attention to? Well, years ago, CDE used this parameter, if you will, in terms of the 20% and the 40% to identify populations that were over or underrepresented. So what this means is that if this composition in the special ed column is more than 20% higher than the composition in the general ed composition, then that is considered an overrepresentation. So that's what you'll find in those two columns with the GE proportion over and under. The data workbook doesn't apply those parameters. What it does is basically says, can you look at your composition between general ed and special ed and identify populations that are elevated in special ed? And what we'll see here is that the same pattern emerges. If we can highlight this African American row down here as well, you'll see that the pattern emerges the same as what we saw with classification. African American and Hispanic populations are overrepresented when we look at it from a composition lens. So this is really a strategy of triangulation. If we look at disproportionality using multiple calculations and we see the same pattern emerging, it provides some credence or some credibility to the fact that there's something that's truly occurring with regard to disproportionality. It's not simply just a data piece or a calculation error or calculation methodology concern. So far we've looked at classification, we've identified Latino and African American, we've looked at composition, identified Hispanic and African American, we find the same pattern. Let's move to the next slide and we'll take a look at risk ratio. A risk ratio is a calculation of risk of being identified for special education. A risk ratio of 1 means that if I as a white student have a risk ratio of 1, I have the same risk of being identified for special education as every other racial ethnic group within that organization. So what we see here, if we just look at this top row going across, I've highlighted in yellow risk between 1 and 1.5. In red, it's 1.5 and higher, so it's an elevated risk. And looking at a risk ratio, we see that the African American Latino population, again, is the same group that comes up in terms of an elevated risk. All right, I'm going to ask you to use this just a little bit, and there's a polling option. So on the left-hand side, right above the where you see your name in the participants pod, to the far right, you should see a letter A in a box, and there's a poll in there, A, B, C, D, and E. So use that to respond to this question. So let's take a look at this slide. Which of the following groups has the second highest risk for being identified for special education? Go ahead and take a second to use that poll on the left-hand side and enter your response.
Okay, so if you haven't responded yet, the poll is right below where your name is to the right, and there's a little A there, and please go ahead and select your choice of which of the following group has the second highest risk for being identified for special education.
And I'm seeing a pattern emerge. It looks like most people are responding with B, which should be correct. We're identifying the Latino population at a risk of 1.5. So African American is a risk of almost 2.0. If I had a risk of 2 up there, it would say I had twice the likelihood of being identified as eligible for special ed if I'm African American in this particular district. All right, the next slide adds another indicator or another data point to this, and it adds the disability factor. So before we were just looking at overall identification in special education, now this looks at disability. So in this, we run risk ratios by race and ethnicity and disability. What I encourage teams to do is look down the columns for patterns and across the rows for patterns. So for example, when I look down the column here, I'm going to look at my white population. I'm going to look at the number of red cells I find. 1, 2, 3, 4 red cells for white. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red cells for African American. And then I've got 4 red cells for American Indian. So my highest risk group overall is African American if I look at it just by disabilities in cells. When I look across the rows, I'm going to count the number of red cells going across the row, and I'm just going to highlight OHI down at the bottom. There are 4 highlighted cells in OHI. So the reason I do this is because, number one, I want districts to ask the question, what's this experience being identified for special education in this district as an African American student? If I'm identified in this district, what is my likelihood or what is my risk of being identified in one of these categories? Well, the likelihood that I'd be identified as intellectually disabled is elevated in this risk, in this district. My likelihood of being identified as ED is elevated in this district. So what we're getting so far, if we look at this, if this was the same district, we'd see that African American and Latino students are at highest risk. We also see that OHI, in terms of disability, poses the greatest risk for multiple subgroups. And we see 4 as we look across that row. The caution on this is that using a risk ratio in the data workbook, it's not sensitive to small cell size. So you'll look over here at the not reported. There's 1 student in OHI, which poses a risk of almost 2. I wouldn't necessarily get hung up on individual cells when we use this in the data workbook. I would look at overall general trends and patterns that we're seeing. Okay, so those that's the data workbook. That's one report that I use with districts using both the special education data from CASEMIS and the student information system with demographic data. The next set of data, or the report that I use, I just titled supplemental report. I'm not sure really what else to call this, but there are 3 consistent sets of data I look at in here, and then the other piece is up to specific district questions. For example, I was working with a district, they said, we want to take a look at English language learners within special education. I said, okay, fine, let's take a look at what sources of data we have, and let's include that in your supplemental data report. So the 3 areas that we look at: age of entry in the special education, referral source, and then there's a data integrity piece where I do a match of databases to see if we're reporting the same race and ethnicity codes for the same kids as we send information up to TDE. So here's an example of a district. This is a high school district, and you'll see down the bottom that these are blocked or aggregated. So ages 14 through 19, I've aggregated those because one of the questions this district had was, are we inheriting this disproportionality concern from our feeder districts? And so we said, okay, well, let's look at when kids are entering the system by disability and by race ethnicity. So what we found was this is a district who is disproportionate in white ED and white OHI. And so we use these OHI, ED, and SLD. Those are their highest risk disability categories for the district. So look at when kids were entering who currently are eligible under those categories. But they found 36.6%, over a third of the kids that they have as ED in this district are coming in high school. So initially, their thought of inheriting this issue, this really didn't provide a whole lot of credence to that. And so they found that, okay, this is hopeful, this is good in a way, because this is something that we're definitely contributing to, and it's something that we need to work on within our district. Age of entry, this now looks at this ethnicity. So when we look at this, is the same district we looked at on the last slide. So we're looking at high school specifically. African American and Latino populations were higher risk overall for this district. They were not identified as significantly disproportionate in those two areas, Latino and African American overall. However, the commitment of the team in the very beginning was to say, look, if we're looking at issues of equity, we're going to look at this across the board, not just focus on the cells we've been identified in. So African American, Latino were emerging patterns in this district. 14%, there's an elevated rate of identification for African American students in the high school. Next slide. This is a K-12 district, and what we wanted to do is look at patterns and trends with regard to the African American population and white. They were out as white ED, but their African American population overall was shown as disproportionate. So what we find here is we have the major cell that stands out is 18.4%. Very, very different than when we look at the percentage of kids who are entering the system, the special education system in middle school. So what this did for this particular district is when they focused on intervention, they paid more of they placed more of an emphasis on looking at resources in their CEIS plan to the middle school, because that was a large entry point for African American students. Last slide on this supplemental report section is a database comparison. Here's an example from a district. Their student information system reported 1,776 students with disabilities. Their special education system, SACE, is what they use, CASENess, identified 1,757 students. Okay, so that's a difference of 19. The assumption at this point is that these were the same kids and we just maybe missed 19 of them in the SACE fund. Well, the reality is, of those two databases, when we matched up SSIDs, there were only 1,567 students who matched. So for the SIS, that's a difference of 209 students, and SACE, that's a difference of 190 students. That's significant. When we looked at just the students who matched in both databases as students with disabilities, how many of those students had the same race and ethnicity codes, or in other words, or to the reverse of it, how many of those kids did not have the same race and ethnicity codes in both databases? 142 errors in ethnicity, 688 errors in race. With this particular district, we didn't stop here and say, okay, we just need to clean data and that's our problem. What we said is there's obviously a data concern, a data issue that we need to get cleaned up. However, we also know that there are patterns and trends with regards to our African American and Latino population and our white ED and OHI, and so we're going to start cleaning those up. So they still developed a plan regarding around what their data was showing them in disproportionality trends. However, at the same time, they needed to do some cleaning up of data.
John, there's a question. What are some of the common reasons for the errors in with regard to the data?
What I have seen is that for districts who are using SACE, there isn't communication between the two systems both ways. So typically you would have one database that is a database of record for demographic information.
Hello, and welcome to Global Meet, formerly Ready Conference. Please enter your passcode. Please hold while I confirm your passcode. Thank you. Your passcode is confirmed. All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6. When you hear the tone, you will be the 31st person to join the meeting. This meeting is now being recorded.
Through multiple indicators, attendance, GATE, AP participation, graduation, achievement, behavior, eligibility for special ed, you will likely find the same pattern when it's something that is more ingrained within the system.
John, is the orange line just special education discipline?
No, that's overall discipline for that district.
Super, thank you.
Yep. So what we're finding is that in this particular district, they had the risk for African American students being identified for special education overall, I believe, was 1.93%. The risk here is 2.0. It's almost twice the likelihood, or twice the representation on the discipline file. So it's not just a discipline issue. It's not just an identification issue. There's something that's much deeper within the system that's contributing to this disproportionate representation across the board. So when teams see this, the nature changes. The nature of discussion changes. It may not necessarily be just a PBIF initiative. It may not be just an RTI piece. It now may be, well, maybe we need to look at some training in terms of cultural responsiveness. So the importance of looking at multiple data sources, multiple indicators with disproportionality is absolutely critical in terms of identifying where the issue really lies. Here, this kind of drives it home in terms of what I was sharing earlier with the difference between composition and events. So this particular, if we can highlight just the percentage columns for white and African American, this will help point it out. So in this particular district, there are 2,510 students in the general total enrollment, which accounts for 9% of the population being African American. In the discipline file, there were 1,161 students who were African American in that file. That's about 18% of that file. The number of discipline events that those 1,100 plus students created was 5,569 events. So in other words, they created almost 22% of the total discipline events in that district. If we contrast that with the white, 10.9% in total enrollment, 10.2% in the discipline file, 10% of the events. A little bit more streamlined and consistent. You look at the same thing in Hispanic. In fact, it's a little bit under Hispanic. It's not really consistent all the way through. They're underrepresented, if you will, which is not a bad thing. But what this points out is we have fewer kids who are showing up in the office more consistently or more regularly. So not only are we seeing more African American students proportionately showing up in discipline, but they're showing up more often. So this is extremely critical, I think, for districts to realize the impact of discipline practices. Here's the special education piece. So what this is saying is that in this particular district, 44% of students who qualify for special education do so under specific learning disability. When we look at the discipline file, 55% of students with a disability in that discipline file fall under SLD. We can also look down here to ED and highlight the 2% and the 4%. These patterns in terms of SLD and ED are not uncommon. In fact, SLD is almost always higher in terms of discipline. And the reason I point this out is because, oftentimes in terms of focus areas or where districts land with responding to disproportionality, it's typically somewhere in the PBIS or RTI. That's really what I found, and doing some cultural responsive training as part of their Tier 1, building that in to their Tier 1. The importance of having an RTI team or site-level team look at multiple sources of data is critical, because when we look at just achievement data and we separate and have a different team look at discipline data, we're often talking about the same kids, but those two teams aren't really communicating. So when we've set up RTI systems within districts I'm working with, I've encouraged them to have the same team look at multiple sources of data, because you have kids who are in multiple categories. You'll see them showing up on screenings, showing up on the radar in academics, in attendance, and in behavior. And it's the same kid. So this points out in terms of a specific learning disability and behavior, that's it's not uncommon to find that kids who are struggling academically are showing up in the behavior file more frequently or at a higher rate. Here's a ranking by reason, so top 10 reasons by race and ethnicity. What I would be looking for is I'd be looking across these rows to see if there's any discrepancies with regard to subjective disability categories. Defiance, disobedience, classroom disruption, those all involve teacher judgment of some sort, and that's typically where you find disproportionate representation. I'm finding less disproportionality in this area, or less inconsistency rather, in this area as compared with consequences. So typically I'll find that districts are fairly consistent with why kids are being sent to the office. However, when we look at consequence, they're fairly inconsistent with that. So we'll find districts who are maybe their first line, let me just see if I have, here we go. Their first line in terms of responding is suspension, 30% for African American, 29% for white. When we look at calling parents, ranked number 2 or line 2, that's the 4th highest for Latino, but it's the 2nd highest for African American students. So I look at trends in terms of what are we doing with kids once they're here, and are we treating kids differently, when we disaggregate by race and ethnicity. All right, I'm going to stop at that point and give you a second to put into the chat field any questions you might have with regard to New York NYU data workbook, the supplemental report, or the data with regard to office discipline referrals. George, how are we doing on that? You see me?
Hold on just a few more seconds, John.
Okay.
So, seeing disproportionality in length of suspensions as well, someone wrote in. Are you seeing disproportionality in the length of suspensions as well, John?
You need 3 days as opposed to 5 days.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's what the question is.
Right.
You know what? I haven't looked at that with districts, but it would be an interesting question. We could look at that given the data sources we identified in the beginning. We could disaggregate number of days by race and ethnicity. I haven't looked at that, though. That's a good question.
And then someone else writes in, does the study show why the students with SLD have a higher rate of discipline?
Yeah, what we could do is break down the SLD, just the subgroup of students with disabilities under SLD, and look at their reasons for referrals and take a look at trends or patterns in that. So it is possible to do that. I don't know general trends with the districts I've worked with. I haven't typically done that, but it's something that you could do. I can tell you this, a general trend in terms of where discipline events are occurring, it's in the classroom, and typically it's some type of defiance, disruption, or not following directions. So I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of events in SLB fall under those categories as well. So in my mind, I think that's helpful because it's really teacher-student interactions and instructional practices within the classroom. Generally speaking, we typically respond to student behavior. It's very controlling the way that we respond to it, and so that's kind of an area that I would focus teams on to take a look at whether or not that's really the case with the SLB population.
All right, and then the question is, SPED data in our feeder districts will determine our status as disproportionate. High school districts using CEIS funding for general ed population will not alter those practices in data. What do we track for services to general ed students in high school in order to impact what happens in elementary feeder districts?
Okay. So I've got three kind of pieces of three comments to make on that. One, I know John Manson has done some work with a district in this situation, and he ran disproportionality data, the NYU data workbook. He ran that for each of the feeder districts, and I believe worked with the SELPA director in helping the feeder districts be aware of their trends and patterns. So that was one approach. The other two districts I'm working with, one is white autism was the area they found out in elementary. They found that a lot of these students were being identified either through regional center or pre-kinder, and coming in they had over-identification. Their focus was setting up interventions in K2. I believe it was K2, might even been the whole system, K5. Setting up interventions to address the needs of students with autism so that their needs could be met in general ed, and they didn't necessarily require special education services. So that was a strategy. In the other district, part of the question was, what do we have for kids who are coming in as ED and OHI? Those are the two areas they were found out in. This was a high school district, ED and OHI. Well, what they found is, one, their assessment process for re-identification or re-eligibility, re-evaluation, they were doing more of the file review, paper try strategy for a lot of these kids. They never really looked at, it was kind of an automatic stamp. Once a kid was in under OHI and ED, you never really reassessed that. They also looked at where these kids were being served. They found a large majority of their kids with OHI were in general ed 100% of their day. Why are these students in special education? So their approach was taking a look at reassessment practices. Even if kids come to you with a label, reassessment was the focus. And then the other part was looking at interventions that would address that third prong of special ed. Is even though the kid may qualify, do we have the resources in general ed to meet the student's needs? And if the answer is yes, the student no longer qualifies for special ed because his or her needs can be met in general ed. So those were some strategies. Yeah, we can't necessarily fix what we're inheriting, if you will, but we can certainly respond to it by offering interventions in general ed and looking at reassessment practices or educating feeder districts as well. So those are some approaches.
Thanks, John. You go ahead. Okay, so some of this has already come up, but here's the question. What if we have the three self-assessment tools and we use the three reports, but we still have questions about our root causes that we can't really answer? And this is a question that I'll just use the one that someone asked earlier. What about SLD and the reasons why SLD students are being referred for discipline events? Well, that wasn't in any of the reports I've done. However, we do have the data sources to be able to go back and answer that question. So as you were working with your stakeholder group, I want you to see that there are sources of data that we can tap into to answer specific questions that may not necessarily show up in one of these three self-assessment tools. Okay? So some questions that I've seen down the bottom from districts, how do our sites implement the SRT process? That may not necessarily show up in the Wisconsin or the NCREST or the NYU data analysis workbook. So how do we get to that information? Do we send out a survey? Do we run focus groups? Do we start talking to people? I know with one district it was pretty evident just within the stakeholder group that there wasn't a consistent process. You know, in one district it was meeting with the SST coordinator. That's it. I mean, that was their process. And, you know, in another school it was a team. Are we inheriting this from feeder districts? That's a common question. Is this an issue of linguistic difference or ethnicity? That's not in any of these data reports that I've shown you. So we'd have to go back to the data to identify where we could pull data points to address these questions. Here's some other ones. Does identification differ by school type? Elementary, middle, high school. Where are referrals coming from? Trends in terms of behavior incidents.
indicators for A and B, this seems inaccurate. Why am I disproportionate in this area? Why is my district disproportionate in this area? We'd be going to table C to address that. I know one district found that what they had in their student information system didn't match what they reported on case miss, and they're disproportionate because of it. So in that case, it was a data scrubbing issue. So what I'd like to do just on the next 2 slides, here are the 3 data sources I introduced in the very beginning: case miss, office discipline, referral, and student information. And then other is any other data source you could possibly think of to address these questions. I'm going to ask you to use the chat poll or chat box for this. But here's the question: of all students receiving a disciplinary action this year, what percentage are American Indian? That may be a question your stakeholder team asks. So the question is this: what data source would you identify to address that question? And then if you want specifically, which data fields within that source could be used to address that question? So what may be helpful is if you pull up that table, one of those tables that we went through in the very beginning that listed the field types and the possible uses of data, and you match that up. So I'm going to model this for you real quick. I'm going to put in the chat box that for this particular question, I would use ODR data, and specifically I would look at race, ethnicity, and I would use those fields to figure out the percentage of American Indian students that are making up that disciplinary file. I'd be looking at composition. So what I'm asking you on the next one is the same thing. Identify down the bottom either the case list source, the ODR data source, the SIF data source, or another source. And then right after that, put the data field in there. So here's the question, and then I'm going to back out for a little bit and be quiet and ask you to respond in the chat field, how you would respond to this question if it came up in a stakeholder group. For students currently eligible under specific learning disability, at what age did they initially qualify for special ed? When did they first enter the system? So first, would you identify, would you use case miss data for that, ODR data, student information system data, or another source? And then right after it lists the data fields you might use to address that question. Go ahead and put it into the chat pod and submit your answer. All right, about 10 seconds to get that last response, and then I'm going to summarize what I'm seeing show in the chat. Okay, so I'm seeing case miss, face show up in there, which is great. We would use A35, which is the entry date, and A13, which is the birth date. You basically take entry date minus the birth date, and you have an age of entry, and you would look specifically at students under a specific learning disability. I saw there was a comment here about using the student information system. Yes, you could use data in your student information system for this. However, the assumption would be that your data in the student information system is the same as the data in your case miss or your SACE if you use SACE. So if if those are consistent, you could use that. Otherwise, the database of record for special education data is safe in most districts. I would use those data first, just because I think it would be more accurate to identify that. But if they're consistent, you could use either source of data. But entry date and birth date would be the two. Great. All right. Checking in. Any questions, comments? Please put those in the chat box. The last thing I'm going to do here next couple minutes is go through some scenarios from districts. I'm going to show some sample slides from one district and kind of walk through my thinking in that process and tell you a little bit about how this district responded to their disproportionality challenge. All right, George, go ahead and stop me if you start to see questions.
I see nothing.
All right. Sample District 1, let's take a look at this. This is a K-12 unified district. They were identified as African American overall. What we see here is that overall classification rate is 11.4% in this district. They have overall classification rate for African American students is over 19%, and overall classification for Latino is over 15%, almost at 16%. So when I look at this particular district, I'm saying, okay, the emerging pattern I see is African American and Latino. Let's take a look at composition. Composition for this particular district, Hispanic, overrepresented with 13%, almost 14% in the general population, total population, with almost 19% in the special ed composition. African American overrepresented, 12% in general ed, 21% in the special ed file. Emerging trend at this point, African American Latino. Keep in mind this district was only identified as African American overall. Next slide, take a look at risk ratios. Most the population most at risk in this particular district is African American. The other district, or the other racial ethnic group rather, at higher risk is Latino. So at this point, what we've done is we've taken a look at 3 different calculation methodologies, and we found the same pattern in terms of the group that has the highest risk and the second highest risk. For this particular slide, if I look down the column, the African American column, I find that there are 5 high-risk categories. If I look down the Latino column, I can find that there are 4 high-risk categories. Again, that supports the trend that we've been seeing in terms of the highest risk category and the second highest risk category. If I look across the rows in this particular district, I'm seeing that OHI has 4 high-risk categories and SLB has 4 high-risk categories. So at this point, in terms of risk, I'm looking at African American and Latino. I'm looking at overall OHI identification and SLB identification. I also notice on here that the white population is an emerging risk in terms of 4 high-risk categories, and I believe their risk when we look at composition previously just on the edge of being overrepresented. So white is somewhat on the radar, but my 2 highest risk groups are African American and Latino.
Hello, and welcome to Global Meet, formerly Ready Conference. Please enter your passcode. Please hold while I confirm your passcode. Thank you. Your passcode is confirmed. All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6. When you hear the tone, you will be the 30th person to join the meeting. This meeting is now being recorded.
When we look at composition, again, we see African American subgroup being overly identified. I can just make a comment real quick. They were not identified as disproportionate for African American, and part of that may be simply because 3 out of the last 4 years they may not have been consistent in over-identification in that area, so they haven't met the criteria. They may not have been disproportionate on both measures CDE uses to define disproportionality. The reason I say this is because just because they're not identified, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a concern with regard to disproportionality. Again, we see the highest risk group when we look at risk ratio of African American students in the district, second highest being white. And then when we look at disability, we'll find white autism down at the bottom, a risk of 2.0 confirms what they're finding in terms of where they were identified. But if we look just down the column of African American students and white students, you can see that there's definitely a high risk group in those two, African American and white. The trend is pretty clear. We've only got about 6 minutes left. I'm going to skip this and move on to the next one to leave more time for questions. The last slide, and this was probably one of the most pertinent for this particular district, was their database comparison. Their special education file found that there were 52 students with disabilities coded as white, and for those same students in the student information system, they had them coded as Latino. Remember, they were white autism. Of the 52 miscoded white students, 37 fell into the category of autism. That represented about 15% of their total number of students, white autism students. What I did is I moved those numbers around in the e-formula that I use for districts, and according to that, they were no longer disproportionate, according to the e-formula. The finding didn't address the overall disproportionality concern in the district. The white autism group was still at a higher risk, and the African American overall was still extremely elevated. So they didn't stop at just the data piece and say, okay, we're done, we're just going to clean up our data. They developed a plan around the white autism and the African American high risk categories, but it did provide some relief to them knowing that the correction of their data may alleviate an identification the following year. So those are 2 sample districts. The last thing I want to leave you with, data request template. I'm going to switch over and just show briefly my Excel spreadsheet. I believe this was an attachment that was given to you through the Dropbox. And George, can you confirm that you can see it on yours?
It is coming in, and we see it right now.
Okay. So I just want to briefly explain the way that this is organized. This is a template that I give to the IT department in districts when I request data, and it gives the IT folks some direction in terms of what type of data are you requesting and in what format do you want it. So what we'll find is in total enrollment, you'll see 12/1/2012. I ask districts to give me either their SPED file, their data from their SPEDs, or data that's as closely aligned to December 1 of that same year, only because that's when our special ed data are captured and sent up to CDE. So I want to be able to take a look at disproportionality on the same date as possible. Part of the challenge I find is that we have October is when CBED's data are reported, and then we have December when special ed data. Between October and December, students are found eligible for special ed. And so naturally there's an elevation in terms of the number of students we have in our special ed file. What I try to do is capture data as close to the same date as possible. So down the bottom, you'll see total enrollment December 1st if we can. Case miss is December 1st as well. The blue row up at the top is just a field name, district of residence. Under that is a description of what that is. This is a district code that's assigned by CDE, and it's usually 7 digits. Okay? The second tab is organized the same way. These are the data points I use in caseness, and these are the same data points that are identified on that table that I gave to you in the very beginning. And then the last is discipline data. These are the fields that I request from districts to do the discipline data analysis.
So, John, a question. If they recode all those white autism kids to Latino, how high should the concern be that Latino will now be over-identified?
Well, it's a great question. And I have a couple of thoughts. One, in this particular district, the Latino population was a little bit underrepresented in that category, so I wouldn't have huge concerns in that area. The second thing is I remember working with the district in a leadership team meeting, and the deputy superintendent at that time said, well, what do we need to do to kind of move the numbers around to make sure that we're reporting data that would not find us disproportionately high. And keep in mind, it's coming at it from a genuine perspective. We want to obviously correct the issue, but tell me the bottom line, what's the number? And I struggle with that a little bit because when we look at the calculations that are used to define disproportionality, it's a comparison of risk. It's a comparison of one risk to the risk for another group. So, for example, my white population in that district may have an elevated risk, and I'm going to compare that white risk to all other racial ethnic groups within that district for being identified under autism. If I shift students from white into Latino, it changes the risk for white, but it also changes the risk for the other group. And so there isn't a formula that basically says, look, if you can move kids from one cell to the next, we're going to change, because it's changing the risk in two different categories. So I have cautioned districts on not just focusing on numbers, because it really could actually make you disproportionate in one area where you weren't disproportionate in that area before. What I've focused on is if your data are incorrect, if your student information system has these kids coded as Latino, and that's your database of record, then you should probably code them as Latino. But you've got to have one database that says, hey, this is what we're going by as our database of record.
All right. Well, John, we're coming up to the end, and John has consented to stay on and answer any remaining questions there are. Here is his contact information for those of you who want to get a hold of him. Carrie Mills chatted, John, that she'll be getting hold of you shortly for a presentation at Mount Diablo. So, John, we'll stay on the line for a few minutes to answer any outstanding questions. We are going to be sending you this afternoon, participants, an evaluation form. Please take some time and fill it out and send it back to us. And finally, I really appreciate, John, your hard work in preparing and executing this. This was not an easy webinar to do. A wonderful, wonderful job. And thank you, team, for all your support here at the Napa County Office of Education. So with that, this portion,
I just wanted to say that somebody asked about the link for the materials, and the link is not going to go away. If you hold on to that, the materials will stay there and available to you for a couple of weeks at least. Okay, and that's great. So with that, anybody who wants to stay on, either on the chat or ask their questions on the phone, John's going to stay on. And with that, we will conclude this portion of the webinar. Those who want to stay on, please continue to hold. Okay.
Hello, John. You ready for questions?
Yes, please.
Hi, Mary Bacon.
Okay.
One of the things I'm wondering, you commented about one of the experiences that most of us are having, that districts are using RTI and PBIS as their response to the disproportionality. But have you had any experiences with districts that truly, in fact, integrate the culturally responsive aspects of this into their implementation of RTI and PBIS? Because you mentioned something about the evidence of a deeper problem than just looking at how we deal with regular education children in both of those categories.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point, and I do have districts who are doing that. What they're doing is they're infusing training initially into, basically in RTI, they're redefining what their Tier 1 core instructional program looks like, and they're adding a lens of cultural responsiveness. So they're taking a look at walkthrough protocols on instruction, and is that are they looking specifically at practices of cultural responsiveness in the classroom? So what they're trying to do is infuse it in terms of we're adding a lens of cultural responsiveness to our core instructional program in Tier 1. That's the context that I've heard them. So part of it is bringing in the training for that, but the other part of it is having an ongoing focus on cultural responsiveness.
And what
did that answer your question?
What about with regard to behavior?
Well, what I've explained with regard to the behavior, there's a lot of crossover, because when you're looking at most of these behavior issues are occurring in classrooms. That's the general trend. And what we're doing in cultural responsiveness, what you're really doing is it's not necessarily learning about other cultures and now I'm head knowledge, I'm aware, and now I'm culturally responsive. It's understanding the positionality of the teacher and the lens that the teacher uses to view success in that classroom, the lens that that teacher uses to view behavior in that classroom. And so the same skill set that is taught through culture, being culturally responsive, in terms of looking at your own positionality, your own lens, that same skill set transfers in terms of a behavior model and the way we interact with kids. You know, I look at a behavior on the surface and I make an interpretation of that behavior. My interpretation is based on my lived experience and my lens. Well, as a teacher, if I go through training in terms of cultural responsiveness, I'm taught to consider that lens, so to kind of reevaluate that. So that same skill set, that same strategy applies whether it's a racial, ethnic context or whether it's a behavior context. So it's really kind of foundational in a Tier 1 or a core program, whether you're looking at behavior or academics.
Great. Mm-hmm.
All right, so anybody who wants to ask their question via voice, go ahead and press *6, and that'll unmute your phone to ask any questions. Or, as I indicated, you can chat it in the chat box. John, we don't hear you. I think you're trying to talk.
Yeah, I'm muted. I'm looking at, I don't know if Bob Harper's still on. Bobby's still there. I'm looking at your comment in there with the feeder district piece. I know in one, a high school district I'm working with, what they're doing is they're working together as a SELPA to look at trends and patterns in the SELPA, and they've been very cognizant of the fact that three of their feeder districts are currently identified as disproportionate. Two, I believe, are SIGDIS. And so they're looking at where they're being identified as disproportionate and having a conversation about, look, if we have kids coming up as white autism being disproportionate in our feeder school, what can we do in the high school district to be able to better support those kids so when they come up, we don't have to carry that label. So they're having conversations about the data piece, you know, SELPA-wide. They're having conversations about what can they do in feeder districts to make some changes. But at the same time, the high school is very cognizant about, you know, what can we do to kind of curb this. The overall Latino identification was also an area in this particular district, so they're doing things now to try to anticipate what's coming to them with kids who are already identified.
So, John, in chat, Kathy writes, are the tables you presented available in the data analysis workbook? That is the formats. The
format is not available in there. The calculations are. They're the same exact calculations. So the usefulness is the same. It just doesn't look the same.
Okay. Other questions, issues, comments? Okay, so everybody now knows how to get a hold of John for questions or how to get a hold of us. And there we are. And you've all gotten emails from us, so I'll keep it on this. So with that, John, thank you so very, very much. Everybody, thanks for all your attention, good questions and comments. And this will conclude the second portion of our webinar. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.